If there's a coffee shop owner listening right now, your Gen Z barista has a great idea. I can guarantee it.
This is Keys to the Shop, episode 558, Digital Natives and the Future of Coffee Shops. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DiFiorio. I'm your host for the show. And of course, thank you so much for being here. I'm really grateful that you chose to spend some time today. You can choose to spend your time anywhere you like to get information about running a good coffee shop or your coffee career and understanding what goes on to create success in cafes, and that you've chosen to come to Keys to the Shop for that is really meaningful. So thank you. And I would encourage you to invest further by subscribing to the show. And you can do that on YouTube. You can do it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to this show or watch this show. You can benefit from this because you are definitely going to want to stay up to date with all of the content we put out every month, usually about 9, sometimes even 10 episodes when we're counting the shift break episodes we put out on Thursdays. So do that. And also, for those of you who have been here quite a long time, I would encourage you to share these episodes. And I know many of you have, so thank you so much for that. But also take the time to write a 5-star rating or review, put that into Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. All of this really kind of comes together to help the discoverability of Keys to the Shop for people out there looking for a resource. And that's what we want to be. We want to be a resource and literally unlock the potential, like be a key to somebody's shop. So thank you very much. Now, today, I want to just remind you that we have our key holder coaching groups that are starting in September. By the time you listen to this, we're going to be only a couple of weeks away or so from closing the applications for the 5th cohort we're running. We've been doing this for 2 years now, and we've just seen some really awesome conversations and transformations in both the people themselves, the owners that are part of this group, and their businesses. And we've got testimonials that you can interact with. You can go to the webpage on our keystotheshop.com website, go to the coaching groups page, and learn more about what this group is. A cohort of coffee shop owners for 6 months, gathering regularly to help each other succeed. And so this is a paid group. This is a curated group. And I will be making the selections for this group when the time comes. It's usually around a couple of weeks before the actual start date. So you got time. Check the show notes for the link. Or if you just want to be extra quick about it, you can send me a DM on Instagram and say, hey, Chris, let's have a conversation. I'm interested in key holder coaching groups. And we will talk. All right. So today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Arto Brick, at Arto Brick on Instagram, and then the Pacific Barista series, the wonderful plant-based beverage OGs in the space, pacificfoodservice.com. We're going to talk more about our friends, our sponsors for this show later in the episode. But right now, I want to introduce you or reintroduce you to our friend Kosta Kallivrousis, who's going to talk to us about digital natives, which I originally was going to title this Pop Coffee because we were talking about stars and Gen Z and the coffee brands, like Chamberlain Coffee and the like, and the phenomenon of what a new generation of coffee drinkers are doing with coffee and the meaning of coffee to them in their lives and their lifestyles. And this, term digital natives refers to those younger generations who have never had anything but digital advertisement as their main source of advertisement and entertainment and socialization and that kind of thing. It's a predominant feature of their upbringing. And thus the term digital natives, which is not something I don't even know who invented. Kosta probably knows who invented the term, but he's actually written a piece on this for the SCA that's going to be coming out very soon. But on LinkedIn, Kosta had talked about in an article the intrigue that he had toward these brands and the idea that there's a new reality that has emerged and is still emerging that we in the coffee industry who are maybe a little long in the tooth, if you will, should be paying attention to. And so as a certified old guy, I definitely wanted to have this conversation with Kosta, and we kind of bat it back and forth in this conversation. And if you're not familiar with who Kosta is, he's spent 14 years working across the specialty coffee supply chain. He has been just someone who has been a deep thinker and a very thorough contributor to the industry. His unique combination of experience as a barista, he's a licensed Q grader. He's worked in strategic sales for roasted and green coffee companies. So when you think about his experience, it's really this 360-degree view of the industry, or the 30,000 foot to 30 foot in it and above it, to see the big picture and also the minutia and the small things that make up the industry in aggregate. So this is why Kosta can speak the way he does about these subjects. He's just passionate about building equitable sourcing relationships between coffee buyers and producers, and really just challenging industry norms and helping us think and helping us develop the next level of thinking around taste and value, and advocating for better connection in the coffee industry across the entire supply stream. So that's why Kosta is the perfect person to talk about this with. And so, you'll find me playing devil's advocate here in a few places, and Kosta making some points that are going to be, I think, maybe transformational for the way that you run your coffee shop and the way that you perceive your coffee customers. Let's just face it, we serve a multi-generational customer base, and we want to have broad appeal, but we don't want to needlessly alienate, and we don't want to write off young or old. And I think it's wise to go in depth with trying to understand what's happening now so that we can be a brand that is serving people today well. So with that said, I think it's time for us to introduce this conversation with our friend, Kosta Kallivrousis. Well, Kosta, welcome to the show once more. How are you?
I'm doing well. Good to be back.
Yes, good to have you back. So the way it works, it seems, with people who are busy in coffee is that everyone's about doing their business in the world of coffee, and then they post something online, they repost something, and you're like, yes, I got to catch up with what they're doing. And then they post something that's really interesting. And that's what happened with you and I. I've seen you at coffee shows all the time. And then we all go through these seasons where we're just like head down in the work, deep in the work. And then I see, man, Kosta is still just deeply thinking about coffee and the culture of coffee, especially. That's what I appreciate about our conversations, especially. And 5 months ago or so, you had posted something about digital natives and the landscape of coffee related to Emma Chamberlain. And I would say that, because I commented on this, that there is a little bit of like old man yelling at the clouds in me, as well as maybe a lot of people that read that and thinking like, oh, these young people, they just don't get it, or, this will blow over. But there might be more to it than we think. And that's why I'm wanting to talk with you on the show about it, because I think if anyone's going to kind of break this down for us a little bit more, it's somebody who's, I think, been deeply thinking about this for a little bit, especially because you're on the ground working and have been working with relationships that impact farmers directly and thinking about equity as it relates to farmers. But then we're all in this world of, the brand of a pop star's coffee. And it feels like it's so distant and so unrelated. Like, don't we have better things to think about than that? But they're related. And so what is it about the movement right now in coffee, for digital natives especially, that for you, it's something that we need to pay attention to, because it's signaling what success might look like for coffee in the future? Why should we be really taking it seriously?
Yeah, I think like maybe first and foremost would be that like Gen Z, or, what could be labeled just post-millennials at large, which would include Gen Alpha. These are your age groups that are basically like 25 and younger, are really starting to like come into their own money. Gen Z now is worth, I think something like $7 trillion of like money that they like globally hold. And with that, not only coffee, but brands are just having to pay attention to them. I think for a lot of brands, they've established their identity, but also more or less like who they're going to sell to. But as the world goes on, more people are going to die. They tend to be older, and then younger generations are going to end up coming up, and they're going to be the ones that are really driving the ideas of, what the world should look like, but also how are they going to make money and how are they going to spend money. Personally, where this really caught my attention was the way that I saw coffee roasters starting to shift in the types of coffees that they were buying, especially around when COVID ended up became a thing. The biggest shift that I noticed was away from kind of like your unique micro lots and more towards these coffees that were probably like anywhere between like 80 and 84 points. I think there's a few reasons that ended up happening. Certainly with COVID, the thing that coffee roasters and retailers kind of felt the impact the most of was at the retail level. There were several months across like multiple states, but also just globally speaking, where people couldn't access coffee shops in the same way. And I feel like specialty coffee and especially the third wave movement has built its unique value proposition on the cafe. That has just simply not recovered since. If you look at NCA data, coffee consumption within cafes is down by 22%. And it's just been in a slow free fall for the last 5 years. Meanwhile, at-home consumption has basically held steadily, if not slightly increasing, specifically for specialty coffee. You mentioned in the beginning me focusing on farmer equity. Now I feel like as the C market has risen, it's becoming a bit easier for producers to make a good amount of money, at least in the short term, depending on where the C market goes. We'll see. But now I feel like it's on the consumption side of things, or like traditional consuming countries that are really starting to feel the pinch. And to me, like maybe one of like the fundamental aspects of like what keeps this thing going is around taste. We talked about it in the previous podcast around like the idea of the tyranny of taste and how taste and power are mixed together. When I think about it with consumption, I would probably think about it as like taste is a form of aesthetic. And, I've heard this from an associate professor out of Virginia Tech, Jacob Lane, wrote this paper, and he talks about like production is basically the equivalent to ethics, how you produce something. Consumption is aesthetics. What I was talking about beforehand with producers is basically, how aesthetics impact coffee producers. Now I feel like, with the rise of digital natives or post-millennials, however you want to call them, they come with their own aesthetic. And so therefore, they're also impacting the coffee industry.
Yeah. Now, the aesthetic of taste is something that is meaningful to them because the aesthetic is a symbol of who I am as a person.
Yeah.
I belong or I don't belong, right? Mm-hmm. So there's more sustainability in something that touches that part of who we are. And I am just a black coffee person. I always drink it like that. That's who I am. But is it really that deep? I've personally made it that deep. What is it that drives that aesthetic, or historically, how has that aesthetic been driven? My assumption is that previous generations, like the black coffee drinkers, I think they see like movie stars, they see whatever from Hollywood in the 70s and 80s, people drinking black coffee. People are having a culture that's not as frilly as what it is now, if I could put it that way. And so it feels like we're seeking validation for certain choices that we make through, well, that person is doing it, I should do it. So it's this social influence has always been a part of this. Is that the same as what's happening now with the drinks and the styles and the taste that we see, that it's like this affirmation of who we are, and it's a way for us to discover ourselves through the screen?
Yeah, to me, it signals, we belong to something. We belong to someone. It helps us mark like who we are. I'm going to lean pretty heavily on some of the insights. A brand consultant, his name is Euguene Healey, has been kind of like pontificating on. And I think for like specialty coffee and the third wave movement, it's really been rooted in millennial type of identity. He talks about this as like, millennial marketing is essentially this idea of cutting out the middleman, It's about relying on, this idea of craftsmanship, doing the right thing, and then this kind of uncomfortable negotiation that business and politics has made, which is like, we're going to be social justice oriented, but we're also going to be for like making as much profit as possible. And so more or less, that's what the last 35 years have looked like, but especially within like millennial marketing from like that 2012 to 2018, this has been like the idea that brands have like hit on, globally speaking. And especially coffee has been a part of that. I can't think of the amount of brands that come to mind with the, idea of like cutting out middlemen, focusing on the craft, sticking up for like the small guy. But for like this new generation, that message might come across as a bit naive, in the sense of like they've grown up in a world where things really haven't changed or felt like it's moving in a positive direction. And when I look at the coffee industry, I can't help but feel that like they're right. We might have like a greater access to unique microlots and like unique flavor profiles. But in terms of like mixing your politics with business, I don't think it lines up. If I look at like previous time periods, we've talked about this before, but like the International Coffee Agreement from 1962 to 1989, the C market on average was $3.80. And you have to adjust that for inflation in like 2019 dollars. If you look at the time when the market was liberalized, basically from like 1990 up until 2019, it equals out to about like $1.70. So roughly half. And then on top of that, for like every coffee dollar that has been spent, during that ICA period, 30 to 50% was retained within a coffee producing country. Afterwards, we're looking at basically 10%. And so I don't think they're wrong. And I think that fundamentally impacts what is considered meaningful and what isn't. And within the digital natives, the aesthetic that drives them, I think, has been mostly visual, while ours has been like this idea of like slowing down, craftsmanship. You have to have like this intense focus. For them, I think they're starting to view brands as like a form of entertainment instead of like being like arbiters of social justice.
Okay, can I pass something by you here for consideration, that you have such a great internal knowledge of what proves that assumption that nothing has changed. Okay, so, but the average person for whom that promise of the small guy and equity and that kind of thing was attractive doesn't have access as much to that information. And it doesn't seem like they would be investigating truly that, you said they feel that things haven't changed, which doesn't mean that things haven't changed. It just means that maybe they have in some regard, but not to their satisfaction, because they were trained on the idea that the marketing will tell me if and when it's changed, which may or may not be true. So it feels like what you're describing here is a form of liquid nihilism. Like we're kind of giving up. We're like, you know what? Screw it. We're just going to make it colorful. We're going to make it fun, and nothing's going to change. And we're not even going to try to change it. We want to be distracted from whatever the hopeless situation is, which doesn't really give me much hope.
Yeah. No, that's through like that perspective. It totally makes sense. Gen Z, I was just looking into this, is like probably like the most politically active, generation in quite some time. They are kind of making a negotiation, that like business is going to be about entertainment, but then they're going to be serious about politics. I think it's Gen Z who's kind of leading the union push in Starbucks right now more than any other generation. And like I was a Starbucks barista back from like 2009 to 2011, back when they switched to automatic Frankies. And, it always felt like we were one person down. My colleagues had master's degrees in English. I saw more, emotional breakdowns and like mental breakdowns than I would care to ever see within my lifetime, working at a Starbucks. Yet there was never a push for a union up until I think 2021, and that's been mostly led by Gen Z. The people who enjoy colorful frappuccinos are the ones that are more likely, it seems, to also be like, hey, we deserve more workers' rights than what we've been offered by corporations.
Yeah, it's interesting because if I wanted to be cynical about that, it's like, hey, me and more me. and my colorful drink, and I deserve this and that. And it may be true in some cases and may not be true in others. I mean, that maybe in the healthiest of organizations, we might still have some emotional challenges to overcome, which can't be pinned on systems. It might just be pinned on that's life. We don't know. But the idea is even the political activity of people built on, and maybe this is getting off topic, but it does seem to track with the idea that we used to think if we bought fair trade coffee, then we were saving the world. And now we're saying, if I'm not wanting to talk about unions, but it may be lumped in with the idea that as long as we're making our voice heard and we're taking up space and we're unionizing, or we're buying these drinks and we're being very loud, that's going to make a difference too. That's like a replacement for the label, but it's a check on the box. And so that's where the cynicism kind of comes in. Like, is this just the same thing warmed? Is it progress, or is it just our version? Like we take pride in doing the same thing our way.
Yeah. Now, I mean, to be determined.
Yeah.
This is probably like, the honest inflection there. But I also find that like Gen Z just happens to be like a hyper connected group of people. Research from Ogilvy, was demonstrating that they tend to be the most loyal towards brands if they feel like they're heard. And so the idea of collaboration is extremely important. I feel like it's a cohort that kind of says that we're entitled to be heard. And if you're not going to respect that, the inverse of the type of loyalty that they'll demonstrate is they're also the cohort that's most likely to boycott a brand if they feel like they aren't living up to their values. And maybe that's the biggest shift that I see right now between post-millennials and the second group that I've been describing, is there's this expectation with brands that they want to co-create or they want to share. They don't want to be simply viewed as like passive end consumers. They want to be involved in the production of the thing that they're creating. For me, the thing that I fear at the moment, especially as we're kind of seeing this decline, of post-millennials, especially not drinking as much coffee, but then also there's just a decline in the coffee shop, is that if we aren't listening, they're just going to end up going somewhere else.
That loyalty is an interesting word, because you say they're just going to end up going somewhere else. So the loyalty only goes so far. They're loyal to brands who reflect to them, but that doesn't speak of an ethic that transcends themselves. Maybe the naive or idealistic version of the third wave was the idea of there is something that we all need to kind of get knee deep into that's beyond ourselves. It's for undoing systems that have not progressed the farmer, for example. That's an ethic that you can't move on from coffee necessarily and still have that ethic in that sense. And so it almost feels like being a digital native, it might be harder to find something because we've been so, I say we, but they, and even just look at the, boomers and, Gen X people that are just so addicted to Facebook. I mean, everyone's got the virus, man. Everyone's got it. But we're so sensitive to that, it almost undermines the sustained long-term effort it might take to make the difference that we say we want to see in brands, but we don't want to dedicate any kind of meaningful amount of time or involvement in. So it almost feels like hyper consumerism and ego.
Yeah. I mean, I would kind of maybe gently push back and say it's maybe the other way around, that like specialty coffee and third wave have been gatekeepers, and they've been basically protecting their bottom line, but also their own social capital. I feel like coffee producers or anyone from a coffee producing region could speak to that. The last 35 years have not been kind to coffee producers, and there's been a handful of winners that have come out of it. When I talk to second, third, fourth generation coffee producers, their parents or their grandparents describe like the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s as like the golden age of coffee. That's a time period that we basically on within third wave, with the idea of, there have been three waves of consumption. That's straddling between like the first and the second wave, that time frame. But for coffee producers, they describe that as the golden age. And they describe it as the golden age because like they were able to like make money with a cash crop, being coffee. Now we have essentially kind of like pitched this idea to coffee producers that you can make 2 to 3 times as much, but you're going to have to work 2 to 3 times as hard. And you're also going to have to assume all the risk. That's a pretty shitty ethic as far as I'm concerned. And, it might seem, for Gen Z or post-millennials that they're kind of like give it up on life and they're just ready for like a carnival. But I also find them to be basically like viewing brands as replaceable. There's an expectation that they want to build a world together and that they've been alienated from it. Looking at data from Ogilvy, they basically say that like Gen Z or post-millennials, they feel, alienated from politics. They feel alienated from, older generations. And so they're kind of looking to brands now as like the space to co-create the world that they want to see. They don't want brands to be gatekeepers. And if brands are going to act as gatekeepers, they're just simply going to go somewhere else and build their own world. And I think that kind of is a reaction of like growing up like in an online environment. It's really easy to click and go somewhere else. Or, also look at the most popular games with like post millennials. It's Minecraft and Roblox. It's not about having like this perfectly curated, visually stunning product that you put out into the world and then you expect people to appreciate and you make a whole bunch of money. It's the idea of open world and adventure, and the idea that you can build something up quickly and just tear it down just as quickly.
Hey everyone, it's Chris. I wanted to stop here and say thank you for listening again, and also huge thanks to our sponsors, starting with Arto Brick. Go to the Instagram account at Arto Brick. This is a place where you can find great and amazing stonework and tile and hard surfaces for your cafe's construction, remodeling the second cafe that you think you want like this cool wall made of tile, or the floor, backsplash, the surface of your counter. There's all sorts of work that they've done. Interact with their brand on Instagram, and especially reach out to Armin, one of the owners at Arto Brick on Instagram. DM Armin and say you heard about Arto Brick and how they can really help you create something very unique and is just different than the rest through their hard surfaces, tile, and stonework for your cafe. You heard about them from Keys to the Shop. So thanks very much to Arto Brick and Armin. We love what you do. And also our friends at the Pacific Barista Series, who create the line of plant-based beverages that perform amazingly on bar because they're created for baristas. They're created to stand up to the heat from steaming, produce awesome texture for latte art, and also they're created to be balanced in the cup, so the coffee is always the star. So if you want samples of what they've created, go to pacificfoodservice.com and get samples. They are freely sent, and it's just great to taste for yourself, and steam it, use it with your espresso and your drinks, and you'll see what I mean. So if you're looking for great plant-based beverages for your customers, then you should be checking out the Barista Series from Pacific. Now, back to our conversation about digital natives, the future of coffee shops with Kosta Kallivrousis. I'm excited about what you said, and you don't have to be gentle about pushing back either. I know. I think these conversations are necessary because I think people do deserve and are entitled to a certain level of malcontent around these things. I'm always going back to this idea of, okay, so we can tear down what is very well. What are we building? And is there a we? Because baristas are very fond of saying, and I have told many people and still tell people, don't call your coffee shop a family. That it's weird. But there's an assumption that the coffee shop or the business is a replacement for your family in some sense. Like it's the provision of deep meaning and belonging. So it's like
Yeah.
both and. So it feels like there's a tension there, right? And that kind of brings me to this idea of these desires we have are human desires to build, to participate in meaningful things. And so if we have this longing and we feel this ennui towards life, right? Then where is it that we're going to find the most substantial fulfillment of that except in community? That's why it's concerning about coffee shops that they are down since COVID. You mentioned going back to this idea. And, frankly, I'd love to figure out where we went wrong Because if it was indeed valuable, that's the very first thing we would want to build back up after COVID. You would say, oh my gosh, I missed this so much. Let's keep going back because that delivered a lot of value. I don't know if we were delivering that much value to that generation in particular. And there's maybe a lot of reasons for that, but I'm curious what you think about that and what place the cafe has in helping fulfill the needs of this generation.
Two ideas come to mind immediately. One is for post-millennials, and then millennials. And before that, there's the horizontal versus the vertical. And then there's the linear versus the platform. For the horizontal versus the vertical, this is how I think we like to overall, I'm making a lot of generalizations here, but this is how we like to relate to each other. I think for millennials and older generations, like vertical relationships don't feel as jarring. And it kind of leans into this idea of like linear versus platform. So like what I'm talking about with like the linear and the vertical is, it's a respect for whoever is above you overall, or respect your position, I should probably say. And it's kind of embedded in our language within specialty coffee. Our job is to honor the producer. The producer's job is to honor the work of the cupper. The cupper's job is to honor the work of the roaster. The barista's job is to honor, everyone before them. We use this word honor quite often. And for Gen Z or post-millennials, I think they value more of the horizontal relationships to each other. Some individuals just simply might excel or exceed doing one thing versus the other, but it isn't a sense of necessarily honor as it is like that person just happens to be good at that thing, and so let them roll with it. And then, this idea of the linear versus the platform, especially Coffee or Third Wave has built this model on like, a linear supply chain. For digital natives, they've grown up in a world on platforms. And that's the thing that I was talking about earlier, this building up and tearing down quickly. Platforms are much more malleable. And to try to bring it into like the context of specialty coffee shops, I'm starting to see glimpses of the way that coffee shops are viewing themselves more as like a platform and being way more co-collaborative with either the baristas that they're working with or the people that are coming in with the shops. And that's really with coffee raves, which is kind of this really uncomfortable idea. Again, it kind of feels frivolous, it's ethereal. It's become this like global phenomenon that I think we have to pay attention to. And maybe the other thing that I'll mention just very quickly is like, I think it's resonating with post-millennials because it like grabs onto this value of friction, this idea that these two things feel incoherent and they aren't supposed to go together. And we're going to put them together and see what happens. And if it works, it works. And if it doesn't, so what? We'll move on to the next thing.
Dude, listen, the coffee rave used to be Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg.
Yeah.
The beatniks and hippies that were in Pete's Coffee when it first started, the whole history of coffee is replete with, and this is what, I've heard people talk in Ethiopian culture as well, that it's a gathering and a hospitality and a conduit through which life is platformed. So I guess it seems like no surprise that coffee would be constantly orbiting around or firmly centered on platforming, because that's what it's always been. People with a guitar, people with a notebook, or people with a turntable, I suppose it's all the same kind of a thing. So then the coffee shop has a particular job to do in order to honor that thing, because that's the work too. The farmer is the one who produces the coffee, but the consumer produces the demand that closes that circle, that cyclical nature of what we do, right? And so when you look at brands, because we started talking about people that are pop stars and people that have coffee brands now, and they see that as an aesthetic that identifies with their audience at some level. How do you see the current state of coffee marketing shaping the landscape of actual in real life experiences?
It's going to be an interesting one. I mean, one, it just comes down to like, do you understand the generation that you're speaking to? And it isn't like I deserve to be heard because I have a company. I've heard late anthropologist David Graeber describe culture as a structure of feeling. And so can we understand what post-millennials want to feel or what they want to experience from brands or coffee? Emma Chamberlain's a really funny one. She's kind of out there just doing whatever she wants, but also her content is like carefully curated. It's messy, but it's intentionally messy. It feels really unpolished. And, if I compare Emma Chamberlain to James Hoffman, they couldn't feel more opposed to one another. And I kind of feel like in many ways, she is an anti-James Hoffman. James probably represents, millennial values for the specialty coffee professional better than anyone that I can think of. Like in the video that I ended up posting on Instagram with Emma Chamberlain, it was a bit wild. I mean, I get a decent amount of likes, normally like 200 to 300 when I end up posting on Instagram. That one ended up getting, I think, around 3,000 likes and 72,000 views. It really hit like a chord with people. But the thing that makes me a bit nervous is like the comments that I ended up receiving about it, which was this sense of like, either haha, funny, or like, oof, that hurts, but also I felt like not seeing the moment. This is Emma Chamberlain Coffee ended up making $20 million in 2024. This is territory of like some of the largest third wave brands, that I've been building for the last 20 years or so. It's serious money. And it's a cohort that I think deserves to be listened to. And I think Emma Chamberlain in particular probably deserves to be intently studied if like specialty coffee or third wave, or just honestly, just like coffee brands in general, are going to continue to attract post-millennials. The inverse of this is that we just continue to do what we're doing, which will probably steadily grow, if not decline. But what could end up happening is we could lose a generation of coffee drinkers. That's exactly what happened between basically 1970 through 1988. Coffee consumption in 1967 was at 75% in the US. By 1988, it was at 50%. And the whole industry was scrambling to try to find out how to attract the new generation of coffee drinkers.
It almost feels like a mistake to say, okay, then I'm going to subscribe to her social channels. I'm going to study this cohort of people. I'm going to see what they like, and I'm going to put new menu items on my menu. I'm going to start a social media campaign that's irreverent and, devil may care and all this kind of stuff. I'm just going to apply the mask of understanding. I speak your language. It's, hey, fellow kids, I'm here now. I saw the light after I listened to Kosta. Here I am. But it feels like that would be a little bit. It wouldn't work. What I hear you saying is that you have to understand what's underneath. The manifestation of their feelings might be a trending item. It might be a viral video, but it's let the cart before the horse. That's not the cause. So what is it that's beneath that coffee shops can get involved with and tap into that isn't just trend chasing and applying a surface level aesthetic to try to almost trick people into buying their coffee and capturing some of that 20 mil.
Yeah, I think you hit it. It is like that meme, Steve Bellucci, is it? Where he's like in high school. Yeah. What's his name?
Buscemi.
Gosh, I'm awful. But he's like, what's up, my fellow students? It could feel like that moment. And that's why, I mentioned Graeber's quote, culture is a structure of feeling. It has to feel like you get it. I don't know how to teach that. And I think that's honestly probably going to be the biggest hurdle, I think, for any coffee brand. Are they willing to sincerely listen to someone or something that just feels wildly wrong? In America, that's not a gift that I've seen very many people be able to like demonstrate. And it's going to, I think, require a wild amount of empathy to go ahead and maybe listen to a 17-year-old and take a shot on their idea. I ended up writing a piece for Barista Magazine on coffee raves, and it was on this coffee shop, Wells, in Fort Lauderdale. And I saw it pop up on Instagram, and I was like, oh my God, this thing that I've been like reading in India is happening in Miami. I grew up in Tampa, Florida. So for me, I still have like an affinity for Florida. And so I reached out to Brandon and asked him like, hey, how did this happen? And he basically was like scrolling through IG, saw it. He's like, whoa, that looks cool. And then his daughter, who works at the coffee shop as well, was like, hey, one of the baristas happens to be a DJ and he does coffee raves. I think we should give it a shot. They did it. First one went pretty well. After 3 of them, they ended up attracting like 700 people. But it is going to have to assume this idea that like you have to listen to the generation in front of you. Do you have enough, I think, guts or risk to go ahead and listen to someone that like is much younger than you, maybe 20 years younger than you, and to try something? Maybe it sticks, maybe it doesn't. But I have to imagine that post-millennials will understand much, much, much better what resonates with their own cohort than, me or you.
There's a sense in which the multi-generational nature of a coffee shop's customer base still a reality. And I don't think people should hear this as we're talking about ignoring the boomers and the Gen X and the whatever. Those are still your customers. It feels like then we're at an impasse. Oh, we're going to have coffee raves and alienate people. No, you don't necessarily need to, because maybe I'm off base here, but you're not going to be that post-millennial person, and they'll never accept you as one of them because you're not. And at the same time, I will accept somebody who values me as a person. And maybe I'm full of it and I know it, and you gave me a shot and it didn't work out. And I kind of knew in the back of my head, I was just having a lot of hubris. And most of us did in the early 2000s anyway. And with coffee, we just did a bunch of weird things. And we're like, yeah, it was kind of fun, but it was stupid. But the people that were very sincere towards us, we never saw them as that's my generation, but that's the person who values me. That's the brand who values me, or the cafe who I can see a safe place to be in. It doesn't necessarily need to say yes to everything I do or say or think, but I think of people way outside my generation. There's a lot of even very much older people that are beloved in the coffee industry. The late Gianni, with Nuova Simonelli. I mean, that man's t-shirt is like 10 feet from me right now. He would dance. There's videos of him dancing at coffee parties and all these things. But the thing that he did that I think that coffee shops might want to do is every time you saw him, what did he do? He gave you a hug. And so what do you do as a coffee company? How do you hug your customers in a realistic way, right?
Yeah, God, to bring it back to Gianni, I always felt like he was just one of us, even though, he was like so distant in so many different ways, from Italy, but living in Vancouver, I think.
Vancouver, yeah. He had a vegetable garden in Vancouver and, raced cars in Italy.
But never, there was that feeling like he never looked down on you. There was never this feeling of being aloof, and there was always respect. And that's probably the energy that needs to be captured at the moment when it comes to thinking or listening to post-millennials. They just understand themselves, and I feel like they understand their own generation. I think Gianni probably got that, probably did very, very, very well because he did get it.
Yeah, he got it. And he didn't need to be the best at knowing everything about you or what you loved, but it was the you that made it a big deal. And so when it comes to the coffee shop as a place that's always been a third place, it's a reflection. It should be in pursuit of being a reflection of their community, right? So it feels like we didn't fulfill our implied or explicit promises to our customers. When we opened, we said we have really good coffee and great service. And people are like, man, I feel like I'm totally a fish out of water here. I feel talked down to, or people are aloof. The coffee is not consistent. The place smells weird. And I've got my house. I mean, is there any truth to this? Is there hope for the coffee shop to take this digital native generation that has a lot more affinity with personal consumption and home coffee now than for coffee shops? Can we win them back by doing better?
Yeah, well, I don't know about millennials, but when I think about post-millennials, the way that I've been thinking about it is basically the third place is dead. Whatever idea we thought it was, it's not that anymore. I think the third space or the third place, at least for post-millennials, probably lives in group chats. Like the third place has always been like that space away from home and away from work. And certainly, in the 90s up until probably COVID, that's what it was. It had probably two distinct aesthetics. One was Central Perk, in the 90s. And then that transformed into, I think, basically the style of the cupping lab with third wave coffee, which probably explains why it felt so off-putting, just kind of whitewashed and sterile. For post-millennials, I feel like it's not just coffee shops, but it's all retail locations. Retail spaces kind of feel like they're transforming into like real life meetups. You mentioned the fact that you probably don't need to like completely alienate or flip upside down what you're doing in order to go ahead and attract or gain post-millennials. I think you're right. But there needs to be an element. For coffee raves, they tend to happen on Saturday mornings. So that's probably a time that you're not going to see older generations coming in and having coffee. That just might be a space that like post-millennials end up dominating for a little bit. But I think there needs to be like a switch in people's minds, at least when it comes to post-millennials, that the cafe is a real life meetup point. It's transforming into an event space instead of like this like daily routine. And probably the third space lives in the digital world instead of the physical world now.
That's a great point. Yeah. And my heart hurts a little bit
that's fair.
Hearing it.
That's really fair.
And only because I feel like there's a lot to be gained from the real life, the nuance of conversation, the pushback, and the being uncomfortable together. The curation of our words online and our images online doesn't really lend to the kind of authenticity we claim we want. It actually lives in real life more than it does online, because we've kind of branded. We have personal brands now, right? Like we all consider ourselves like a personal brand representative of the me brand, right? And in concert with one another in a space, there's no hiding. It's like you're there and there's awkward silences and so let's go online. But it feels like the human condition, we need that connection with one another that transcends the digital. But the digital is a safe place to not risk. And so if there is some risk to be had and gain after and reward after that risk, it feels like, coffee shops are a great place to do that, because it still is kind of set up to be a town square, or it's a public institution. Really, it's a private business, but it sets itself up as a thoroughfare of the community. So these folks still need good service and hospitality and good coffee. It still needs to taste good, right? So it makes me wonder, what might the future coffee shop look like that is embracing sort of the next generation, but still delivering universally needed values to their customers, whether they're boomers or Gen Z.
Yeah. Maybe to go back to what you were lamenting real quick, I would want to distinguish between social media platforms, and kind of like, group chats, whether, it's found on an iPhone or Discord or WhatsApp. Those spaces are, I find, to be a bit different, and maybe the third space lives more in the private chat between like two or three good friends, where they can just simply be vulnerable and be heard, versus having to like posture to each other and, become like a brand in itself, like what you were speaking to, because I think like that reality is like really real. To come back to like what you were saying about coffee shops, it probably would look like, I could imagine for post-millennials, that it's just simply like kind of like era driven. There's this sense of like building up and tearing down, and that space can live as a platform in which those values can be lived. In terms of coffee tasting good, if I look at like NCA data, boomers are probably going to drink coffee at home. They might come into the coffee shop maybe like once or twice a week. There isn't going to be much that's going to change there. And then, for Gen X and millennials, either they're going to drink their specialty coffee at home, probably to save money now, more than anything else. I don't know what's going to happen. I feel like those generations are set in stone. The truth is that like it's very hard to stop drinking coffee. And so at that point, we're basically addicts. I don't know the last time. I mean that in the most subtle way possible. But like, I mean, sincerely, like, when was the last time you stopped drinking coffee for at least 3 months?
Never.
Yeah, right. I did it back in 2022, and it was like a solid month of withdrawals.
Yeah.
It's not like I needed to go to like a facility or anything, but like it's very real. Like we are chemically dependent on this thing. And so the chances of people like stop drinking coffee probably, doesn't happen. But the adoption of coffee drinking, that's the thing that probably is like weighs most heavily on my mind.
Yeah. When the more people are drinking coffee, the more demand for this coffee, and we have more to work with to continue to create and recreate different systems and different ways to deliver value across the value stream, or up and down the value stream, rather. The coffee shop has fumbled in many ways, not delivered on the value. Customers, like, for parking their car, getting out and sitting down and drinking coffee feels like too much of an investment right now, because they already know what the delivery is and it's not exactly what they want. So there's an opportunity here. I don't think there's something to give up. It's, well, how can the coffee shop champion the next generation of coffee drinkers and do so in a way that is just, you talk about aesthetic. That coffee shop is real. You see it, you're experiencing it, highly sensorial. It's the most undeniable experience you could have. And if you do it right, that's a win. That's a huge win that you couldn't get conceptually or theoretically. So I remain hopeful while heartbroken a little bit. And then you're always going to have these stars. It's encouraging, actually, if I think about it long enough, that Emma Chamberlain decided to open a coffee company, that it was not some other kind of a company. There was coffee. So we're still there. We're still in the game.
Yeah, I think it just comes down to, are we listening? I can guarantee that, like, if there's a coffee shop owner listening right now, that your Gen Z barista has a great idea. Yes. I can guarantee it. If, like, you can sit down, sincerely listen, if they feel sincerely respected and heard, like, I can guarantee there's something that makes sense.
Yeah, that's true.
I think it just comes down, like, are we willing to listen or not? Or just dig our heels in and continue to do the same thing that we've been doing?
Well, Kosta, this has been fun to talk about. And as usual with these types of conversations, maybe we're left with some pretty interesting ideas to pursue, but then more questions to answer, which is fun. So I think learning might be one of the best things to continue to do after, thinking about this, especially regarding this next generation. So I appreciate you putting that content out there and being on the show. As always, what a pleasure.
Appreciate it, Chris. Thank you.
Well, everyone, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation. I hope it was challenging, and I would really love to know what you think. You always feel free to leave comments on YouTube and on Instagram also when we put up the reels for these episodes. I think one of the big takeaways here is the idea that, we can, again, seek understanding for why people are making the decisions they are about taste and what it means for them personally. Coffee has always been a platform on which people overlay themselves, and it enhances their life. That's what we want. We want people to feel good, and that good feeling is part of who they are. And so that's not something unique to just older generations. Younger generations want that feeling as well. And so it would be foolish for us to not consider and even create purposeful systems and structures in our businesses to acknowledge, welcome, and include the digital natives in our business, while also serving all of our other customers. I think the big thing here is that you're not trying to just have this cafe that's only for this one generation. What are the evergreen ways that you can build a thriving, profitable business that welcomes all of these people and gives them something that is valuable to them and allows them to interpret and use the beverage and the experience you create for their own purposes? We've done this for, it's thousands of years. That's what coffee has done. And coffee has been and probably always will be. So I'm grateful for Kosta helping us think through these conversations that we should be having. And I'm glad we had this one conversation. And now it's your turn to continue the conversation with your team, with yourself. And if you want to have a conversation with me or with Kosta, then you can reach out as well. The links are in the show notes for that. You can find Kosta on Instagram simply by going to @espresso_patronus, and you will find that link in the show notes as well. And if you want to also click on the links we have for different places where Kosta has written about these subjects, definitely go there. That's a great resource. And if you are interested in reaching out to me and having a conversation or asking questions, go ahead and reach out to chris@keystotheshop.com. And I'd be happy to talk to you about consulting, coaching, the key holder coaching groups, or just what's going on in your life, but in your world of coffee, how I can help. Or, a lot of people who are just listeners, not even prospective clients, want to ask questions. I'd love to just talk with you. So again, that's chris@keystotheshop.com. And with that, that is the end of our show. Thanks everybody for joining us. I hope that this was enriching, challenging, and a fruitful time for you. And as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.